food security include the loss of productive agricultural land, soil fertility, climate change, regional conflict, and slowing agricultural productivity. The significance of bees to food security and our food system should not be ignored. Bees mean more than honey to ongoing food security. It gives me pleasure to introduce Jodie Goldsworthy to speak about bee pollination and food security. Jodie Goldsworthy is a fourth-generation beekeeper and the director of Beechworth Honey. She's incredibly active in and passionate about honeybees and their importance to food security. Her experience and involvement in beekeeping and rural and regional Australia is demonstrated by her biography. In 2011, Jodie was appointed as a member of the Australian Government's Food Processing Industry Strategy Group. She's currently the President of Honey Packers and Marketers Association of Australia and Acamondia Oceania Commission, a peak international beekeeping and honey scientific body. She was a member of the Regional Women's Advocacy Group, providing advice to the Australian Government about issues affecting rural and regional Australia. Jodie was also selected to attend Australia's 2020 Summit.
Many people spend their whole life surrounded by food and even considering themselves foodies, but they don't realise the fundamental link between bees and pollination. Bees pollinate 2/3 of Australia's agricultural production. Around the world, the figure that's given is that 1/3 of all food relies on honeybees for pollination. So if you think about it, 1 out of every 3 mouthfuls of food is reliant on the humble honeybee. At Beechworth Honey Discovery, we've actually developed a Bee Guardian or a Bee Rated menu to showcase just how important bees are. So there are a whole lot of food crops that are actually highly dependent on bees. That is, that they wouldn't exist if it weren't for honeybees. So things like almonds, without bees, almonds aren't pollinated and no nuts are formed. Pumpkins, onions, and you think an onion grows under the ground, how does an onion get pollinated by a honeybee? But it's actually the seed that all the onion growers use to plant the onion crop that has been pollinated by the bees. So the onion flowers, the bees pollinate the flower, and those seeds are used to produce Australia's onion crop. Other things like avocado are very critically dependent on honeybees. So all of these things, not only would they not exist, but the quality also is dependent on the honeybee for pollination. There are other things that are highly dependent on bees. So things like our herbs that grow in the garden, so the things that give all of our menus a huge amount of interest, are highly dependent on bees. Some of these herbs have other small insects that pollinate them as well, but by far the honeybee is the most efficient and the most effective pollinator of all of the insect pollinators out there. Things then that are moderately dependent on honeybees for pollination are things like capsicums and some of the other fruits and vegetables. Then things that are slightly dependent on honeybees also have an amount of other insect pollination with them as well. So a lot of our citrus, the lemons, limes, oranges, those sorts of things are more moderately to slightly dependent on honeybees. And then we've got things that are, the honeybees help to pollinate them, but the predominant pollinator is either wind or other insects. So corn, for example, is a good example of something that is predominantly pollinated by wind. And then there are some things that don't have any reliance on honeybees for pollination. So grapes aren't pollinated by honeybees, so you'll still be able to drink wine, and also the cereal crops are not pollinated by honeybees, so they're all wind pollinated as well. So our diet without the honeybee would look something like a diet of wine, cereals, so breads, pastas, those sorts of things, and things like fish, because of course a honeybee doesn't have anything to do with fish. The other proteins, such as the lambs and pork and dairy and our meat, those animals actually graze off pastures that are highly dependent on bees for pollination. So without clovers, without lucerne, a lot of that protein production would be severely impacted, and we'd be relying on feeding those animals a diet of entirely grain.
Shelves at the local supermarket, greengrocer, deli, butcher and farmers market would be heavily impacted without honeybee pollination. For example, foods totally reliant on bees include almonds, celery, apples, carrots, avocado, broccoli, pumpkin, cabbage, onions, blueberries, cucumber. Diets are diversifying and pollinator-dependent crops has quadrupled since 1961. Honeybees are also vital for the production of coffee beans, tea plants and cocoa. Staple grains such as corn, wheat and rice are not dependent on the pollination of bees. Therefore, our diet would be heavily grain-based, including cereals, bread, and very limited in regard to the variety of fruit and vegetables available at the greengrocers. Fortunately, there still would be grapes for the production of wine.
Produce as much food as has been produced in the history of mankind. So we really need honeybees not only to underpin that food production system, we need them to be responsible for the increase in yield. And so you see with some intensive agriculture industries, for example blueberries, where they're growing vast quantities of blueberries under netting, we actually, as beekeepers, bring our hives in, put them in with the blueberries under the netting, and the honeybees pollinate that blueberry crop in there. In tomato crops, for example, honeybees are brought into greenhouses and help with the pollination of tomatoes. Tomatoes are one of those crops that are moderately dependent on honeybees, but the tomato growers have worked out that their yield is increased if they include honeybees as part of that production system. The fact that honeybees are so critically important for pollination is well known. The Australian government has done 3 federal parliamentary inquiries into the importance of bees to food security. The first one, More Than Honey, in 2008, just uncovered some of the problems associated with bees, and I guess it also found out that there's really no other alternative pollinators that can do the work of honeybees. So around the world, as we've seen things like colony collapse disorder and varroa mite actually take a hold, we've seen honeybee populations become decimated. In the US, hive bee numbers have halved. Similar stories for the European Union and other parts of the world. In Australia, we're really worried about the entry of varroa because our land is so sparsely populated that when the feral bee population that does a lot of the incidental pollination across the country, where there's no beekeepers but the wild bees live in trees or out there in the environment, when they die, there's just not going to be enough bees around to make up for that shortfall of bees. So in more densely populated places like the US and Europe, it's been the hobby beekeepers who have filled in that patchwork to make sure that there's enough bees for pollination, but in Australia there just simply isn't. In the US, the President has put together a White House strategy that is all about protecting honeybees. In other parts of the world, there are also policymakers actually starting to look at bee-friendly policies. And in Australia, in Victoria, the Victorian government is actually the very first government of any government in Australia to have an apiculture policy. So this is something that we're actually encouraging the federal government to look at coming into the next election. In Australia, we're really fortunate that that we are the last country not to have the deadly varroa mite, which has decimated honeybee populations around the world. It's been responsible for halving the numbers of bees in the US, and combined with bee diseases, the environment is really important for honeybees. So a lot of people actually ask what can they do in their own backyard to make their local environment more attractive for honeybees. So the key really is to having lots of flowering plants throughout the season. So bees need a source of both pollen and nectar. The nectar they use as their carbohydrate source, and that's what they make honey from, and the pollen they actually use for their protein source. So while they're flying around visiting flowers, they're actually also collecting pollen for breeding within the hive. So in order for them to have a source of pollen, we need to make sure that we have flowers that start early in the springtime, and then different flowers flower throughout the different months of the year during the warmer months. So July, when it's the weather is above 14 degrees. So as long as we've got flowers flowering, different flowers, they can collect different sources of pollen and nectar throughout that time. And as beekeepers, that's why we pick up our hives and move them to a new nectar and pollen source. So we're always moving to them to where there are new flowers flowering. But in your own backyard, it's about thinking like a honeybee and taking yourself out into the garden and looking at what flowers you've got flowering at the moment and what ones are actually coming into flower. And if there isn't any, then you've effectively got a drought, or it's like visiting the supermarket when the truck hasn't arrived with the groceries and there's actually nothing there for you to buy. So it's just common sense. The other thing we can do is just make sure that we're not using chemicals and pesticides in our backyards. And if we have to, then we would make sure that we sprayed at night when the bees are actually inside their hive, and are using even some of the organic type pesticides and things can still be lethal to honeybees. So we have to be really careful when we're using any sort of chemicals around bees.
How can we be helpful? Be organic. Purchasing organic produce contributes to the minimalisation of pesticides and herbicides being introduced into the environment. Sustainable farming benefits bees. Be a local shopper. Farmers supplying local farmers markets are less likely to engage in monoculture. Be a gardener. Plant bee-friendly flowers and fruit trees and avoid the use of pesticides. Most household pests can be eradicated without the use of toxic pesticides. Be active. Advocate for planting of bee-friendly native flora in community spaces such as public open spaces and roadsides. Be a hive host. Contribute to the cross-pollination of local flora.
In our bee garden, we've also included native bee hotels because a lot of the native bees are actually the forgotten pollinators. So as beekeepers, we also care about the other native bees that exist in our environment, and you can just include they are solitary bees, so you can include a small bee hotel. We've got large ones here, and some flowers that again are natives that the native bees also like. We have the blue banded bee here in Beechworth, and they really like blue coloured flowers, so we've planted blue flowers beside our native bee hotels for that reason.